Logan, living
Yeah.
in Faribault my whole life, I never quite understood what all the hype was about with Defeat of Jesse James days. Like, it was fun to go up and dress up like a cowboy. Northfield's
Yeah.
got a beautiful downtown, but I just didn't understand if they didn't succeed in the robbery, then what's all the hubbub about?
Oh, you're exactly right. It's about the clothes. It's about the fashion. It's about the hats, the boots.
I'm gonna take that to heart. I'll get back to you after the intro. Hello, and welcome to class again today.
Hi, everybody.
I'm Sam. I'm Mrs. Temple's son, if you remember.
You may not recognize him because of the hat.
Right, Logan. Why do you think I'm wearing this hat? This hat today?
Well, I think it's because you haven't showered yet and you don't want us to see your hair. But
That is one possible answer.
yeah.
The other is that it's the closest thing I have to a cowboy hat here.
Oh my gosh, a cowboy hat? Why would you be wearing a cowboy hat? That sounds really.
Yeah, well, we're not talking about cowboys, but we are talking about.
This is weird then.
What's the word? Gunslinging.
Outlaws?
Outlaws. There you go. That's the word. And actually,
Outlaws?
this hat isn't too different, huh?
Outlaws? What kind of outlaws?
Why, the James Younger gang, of course.
Oh my gosh, the famous James Younger gang of the failed Northfield bank raid that happened in Northfield?
On September 7th, 1876. That's right.
I'm really excited to talk about this.
Me too. Now, a lot of these kids have probably heard this story before. They've probably had reenactors come to their school. They've probably been to Defeat of Jesse James days itself. So we can decide how much detail we want to go into and how much we want to talk about overall how this affected Northfield history. Logan, why don't you remind people, a lot of this takes place at the Scriver building. Do you want to remind us where we might have heard that name before?
The Scriver building, yeah. Well, attentive listeners, people with good memories might remember that the Scriver building is that limestone building that the cows got stuck under that was built by Hiram Scriver. You might remember this fellow, one of the first mayor of Northfield. It's that yellowish building right on Bridge Square. And the First National Bank of Northfield was housed in this building right next to a hardware store. So
you really wanted to hit hardware store hard there. You wanted to.
I did. It's cool. It comes up later in the story. But the Scriver building, yes, Hiram Scriver. You've seen this guy before. It's all connected.
It's all connected. History is one big narrative of intertwining lives, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
September 7th, 1876. Kind of went to a Rod Serling there. A day like any other.
I think that reference is gonna hit hard with this audience.
Yeah, kids go on Netflix, watch you know what? Get your parents to pick out some episodes of The Twilight Zone. There's a lot of drinking and smoking in it, actually. Probably not the most appropriate, probably outdated. Gender and race roles in it. But other than that, a great narrative piece.
Yeah.
Twilight Zone's appropriate. It'll be fine.
So, 1876.
September 7th, 1876. A date like any other in the sleepy town of Northfield, Minnesota. The nation is in its centennial year.
That means in 1876, America had been around for 100 years. And so the country was celebrating the entire year long. There are a lot of celebrations going on celebrating that.
Yes. But the small town of Northfield was in all jubilee. I really am enjoying this.
I can tell.
they were just coming off a depression, an economic thing.
Recession.
Logan, why don't we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So a recession is when the economy, so the entire money making system, people's jobs, and the banking system starts to slow down instead of speed up. People lose their jobs, banks close, and people run out of money. And in 1876, one of these recessions had happened just a couple years earlier. So the entire country was just beginning to recover from this recession, and they were in the midst of all these celebrations. And that's what's happening in the country, generally speaking.
That's right. So money's not doing great. This bank is still holding on. It's
The
a
First
normal day.
National Bank of Northfield, yeah.
First National Bank of Northfield, housed in Scriber Building.
Mhm.
When a small band of mysterious folks in these long white frocks ride into town.
Dusters, really.
Frocks is more fun to say.
It is more fun to say.
But it's wrong.
Uh-huh.
Logan, who are these people riding into Northfield on this September day?
Well, imagine, if you will, with me, that you're a Northfield citizen in 1876. You're approaching being dressed for the part, so that's great. But he's looking for another costume piece.
I've got a toy gun, but that might make it inappropriate for school.
Yeah.
So
Imagine with me that you are a Northfield citizen and you see these people come into town. They're on beautiful horses, some of the biggest horses you've ever seen. They look like these horses are built for long distance. They're very well bred, and
horses are built for long distance. They've got a deep tread, tires on them.
Yeah, that's right.
4-wheel drive.
Yeah,
good
great
gas mileage.
Yeah, miles per gallon is really swell on these horses.
Yeah.
And you notice their big wide-brimmed hats.
Oats per stomach.
Yeah.
Those Saudi oats, the prices are going down.
Yes, and you notice, like you mentioned, these long white dusters, these overcoats that are really long, covering their pants, going very long. And that's not how people are generally dressed. As you look around in Northfield, it makes these men stand out. And so you think to yourself, okay, I get these guys might be, I've seen people come through wearing this before, maybe a couple years ago. Typically people do it when they're herding cows. When they're herding cows and moving them out west, you don't want dust to get all over your clothes. So you put on these big dusters, and they help you just cover up your body. Perfect. Yeah, just like this. It's more, I'm getting more Elvis than I am Wild West, but that's fine too. And that's great. What you don't know is that these men are using their long dusters, their long clothes, to cover up guns that they have on their waists. So the guns are covered up. They're not walking around with the guns out. There you go. Perfect. Just like that, as they walk on their horses. And so you have no idea that these men, they're not herding cows at all. They are, in fact, members of the infamous James Younger gang of outlaws.
Who are they?
Wow.
Glad you asked.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Because really you're the one who asked. But these men, starting after the Civil War, which we talked about slavery in an earlier episode, and the Civil War, I'm sure you guys have talked about it or heard about it in class, but the Civil War was a time when the nation, the entire country itself, broke apart about this question about slavery, about whether it was wrong or not. And enormous amounts of fighting, enormous amounts of bloody combat happened in this war. It was a really destructive, terrible time for the country. And what happened was the Civil War was ended, and slavery was ended, and that the form of slavery that existed then was over, and people were changed forever by the Civil War. And people like the James Younger gang were men who had fought for the South, who had believed that slavery was not wrong, who had been willing to fight and die to defend slavery. And after the Civil War, when slavery was over, they felt that hatred, and the violence that they had seen changed them in a lot of ways, or brought out things in them that already existed. And so after the war, these specific first these men named Frank James and Cole Younger, they're the oldest members of the gang. They started out, they got a couple of their friends together, and they started robbing banks in the South, stealing people's money, spending it on fancy clothes, fancy horses, fancy guns, and storing it in their houses and that kind of thing. So motivated by greed, by desire for money, and for a love of violence. Bad men, not good guys. But what happens is, in the South, there's a lot of hatred still, and there's a lot of fear because of the destruction of the Civil War, of how people had seen their lives torn apart. And the James Younger gang, Frank James and Cole Younger, and then their brothers, including Jesse James and Bob Younger and Jim Younger, all get together, and they start to use that to their advantage. In the chaos and the fear that people have, they start telling these stories about themselves. They start making up these ideas about themselves, that somehow they're fighting against the banks for the people of the South, even though they're stealing the money of the people from the South. But they write all these elaborate stories. They tell all these wild tales about themselves, and they become heroes down south. But after about 10 years, people start to get wise to their tricks and their wild tales, and the people of the South are starting to hunt down the James Younger gang, and it's getting harder for them to rob banks and trains. And so they decide to head north, somewhere they've never been before, and they find themselves in Minnesota. And they go around Minnesota and they try to find a good place to rob. And they expect all the people in Minnesota in the north they're going to be easy to push over. They're not going to fight back like the people in the South sometimes do. There's no chance that there will be any problems. They think this will be their one final thing. They ought to be able to just rob an entire bank and pretty much be scot-free for the rest of their lives. Some people think the James Younger gang was about to flee to Canada, and so their idea would have been to make one last big hit in Minnesota and then head north and be free for the rest of their lives. And we all know now that's not exactly what happened. But so why don't you read a little bit about what happens when they show up in Northfield on that fateful day?
Okay, well, I had to take the duster off, just as they had to blow back their duster when a few members of the gang entered the bank and made clear that this was a robbery in place. The teller had just finished helping a customer. He walked out, and in entered a few members of the gang. Let me get the book.
Yeah.
Which members?
We've got about 10 minutes. So
right. This is your pop quiz, Logan. Which members of the gang entered the bank?
That's a great question. Well, it was one of the leaders of the gang, Frank James, along with Cole Younger's brother, Bob Younger, and then finally someone who wasn't related to the gang, a big man, a big large man, known by the name of Clell Miller was outside. Bill Chadwell.
It's a funny name.
Clell Miller is a funny name. Is it Bill Chadwell inside?
Is that your final answer?
Yes.
Charlie
Pitts.
It's Charlie Pitts.
Then in the final member, Charlie Pitts, who's an enormous man, a friend of Cole Younger's from about 7 years earlier. Yeah, so those are the men heading inside the bank.
That's right. And who do they come in contact with when they enter the bank? Because are there 3 people working?
There are 3 people working. There's Alonzo Bunker and Frank Wilcox, who are manning the bookkeeper and the teller. So that means they're the people who, when you come into the bank, they're the guys you talk to right away. And then over in the corner was a man acting as the cashier. His name was Joseph Lee Haywood. And he wasn't normally the cashier. He wasn't supposed to be the cashier, but their regular cashier was in Philadelphia because Philadelphia was having a big celebration of the 100-year anniversary of America. Like we mentioned earlier, the entire country was celebrating. And so the regular cashier was off taking part in the celebrations. So those are the people inside.
That's right. And through the citizens start to notice that something is wrong. And a man, J.S. Allen, runs through the street, says, "Get your guns, boys. They're robbing the bank." And that's when gunfire erupts in the city, in this young town. Townspeople start taking out their own revolvers and their own rifles, setting up in street windows and in balconies, and just firing at the outlaws in the streets. And the James Gang is not used to this sort of resistance. So this is kind of an unexpected fight.
Absolutely.
Citizens are dying. Several of the gang members are dying. And inside the bank, putting up a fight are the two regular employees and the substitute man, Joseph Lee Haywood, who is refusing, trying to trick the bandits in any way that he can, trying to get them to not take the money from the safe, because, as we said, this was a very fragile state for Northfield to be in, and this was essentially all of the town's money that they had in savings. So if he had to give it up, that would be incredibly difficult for the town. There was no insurance or way for them to get the money back if they stole it. And the James Gang were notorious for, obviously, getting away with it. So it would be very difficult for Northfield to recover from this. And ultimately, Joseph Lee Haywood refuses and refuses and refuses. The other two cashiers are able to escape. And Frank James, Jesse James' brother, kills Joseph Lee Haywood. Kill him, they grab what money they can, and they escape. But they weren't able to get into the safe because of how Joseph Lee Haywood fought. So who all from the community and who all from the gang died that day, Logan?
Well, it was a quarter of the gang that died that day. So two of their men. And it was out on the street, in the street fighting. It was Bill Chadwell and Clell Miller. They were both shot out on the street. Clell Miller was shot by Henry Wheeler, and Bill Chadwell was shot by J.S. Allen. J.S. Allen had found a gun in his hardware store, which is why that hardware store bit was important from earlier. And he had loaded it up and shot Bill Chadwell. He had also shot, or Henry Wheeler had also shot Bob Younger in the arm in addition to killing Clell Miller. Now, what's interesting about Henry Wheeler is that the gun that he had used was this old Civil War rifle that had just been hanging in the lobby of a hotel. And that's actually, it's kind of symbolic because in a lot of ways, some of the reasons why people were fighting back in Northfield was because plenty of them were Civil War veterans themselves. So they had learned about fighting. They knew how to fight. They knew how to handle a gun, and that was part of the reason they were able to fight back. Joseph Lee Haywood, for example, even though he didn't use a gun in the bank, he had been a Civil War veteran. He had seen some really tough times in the Civil War. He had been through a lot, and it must have hardened him in some ways. It meant that he had a soul that was ready to fight when the James Younger gang tried to rob the people of Northfield, and it's what made him a hero. So that's and then the people who died that day were Joseph Lee Haywood, like you mentioned, and then as the outlaws were leaving, they came across a man named Nicholas Gustafson who had been wandering around on the street, trying to get his bearings. And as the outlaws left, they were telling him to get out of the way. And this was a Swedish man. He was an immigrant. Sources say he didn't know English that well or at all. He didn't understand what was going on. And Cole Younger, most sources say, fired a shot at him. Nicholas Gustafson was grazed in the side of the head. and he died a few days later from the wound. So that's everyone who died that day.
Yeah. But the living members of the gang escaped, and it resulted in this massive manhunt for this gang. They were eventually tracked down, and those who survived the manhunt were captured and arrested, and came back actually to Rice County, and they were tried in Faribault. What happened to those what happened to the gang members after that?
Right. So, like you said, they were tracked down by this massive manhunt. The people of Minnesota, the entire state, came together to fight back. And eventually, Frank James and Jesse James, they split off and they ran away. They ran away into North Dakota, and they got away. And Jesse James was eventually assassinated. He was shot by a member of his gang, and so he died. But Frank James got away scot-free. But so that leaves the younger brothers and Charlie Pitts in Minnesota still. And they were hunted down eventually in this place called Hanska Slough, where the younger brothers, so that's Cole, Jim, and Bob, along with Charlie Pitts, were found by this group of local citizens, and there was this big shootout for minutes, just a couple minutes, and then it was over. Charlie Pitts was shot and killed, and all the younger brothers were shot a bunch of times, but they all survived. They were brought to Faribault, where they were tried in the Rice County Courthouse that's still in Faribault, I believe. I don't know if it's the same one, but they were tried in the Rice County Courthouse, and they were brought to Stillwater Prison for life sentences. And Bob Younger died in prison. They were given parole, which means they were allowed, after 25 years, the younger brothers were allowed out of prison for the first time. Cole Younger left eventually, and he went back home to Missouri. And Jim Younger died just after leaving prison.
But Frank James, he got away.
Frank James, the guy who killed Joseph Lee Haywood, he got away. He was never convicted of any crimes. And some people in the South still think he's a hero. But he is most definitely not. But most of the gang, but because of Joseph Lee Haywood fighting back, because of the people of Northfield fighting back, and the people of Minnesota fighting against the outlaws, the James Younger gang never robbed another bank or train. They never killed another man or woman or child. And most of them either died or were put in jail for a very long time. All because of Northfield fighting back. So that's why every year we celebrate the heroism of Joseph Lee Haywood, of the people in town, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. How can the class delve deeper into the story? How can they learn more? That's
a great question. There are a couple great things you can do when the Northfield Historical Society opens back up. Please, there's new exhibits coming actually. There's a redesign of the entire place coming soon. So if you've been there before, come again to see the new stuff when it opens back up. And if you've never been, then absolutely go down there as soon as you can. It's a really great place. You'll have some incredible tour guides who can walk you through so much more details about the story. You can see some artifacts from the time, some guns that were used by the outlaws, guns that were used by the people fighting back, a lot of trinkets from Northfield at the time. It's a really cool place to go.
Yeah. Why do you think it is so? Why is this story so important to Northfield's history? Why do we celebrate Joseph Lee Haywood and those who fought back?
Yeah, well, it's a couple reasons. First of all is the more selfish one, which is that if we hadn't fought back, the James Younger gang would have taken every cent in the First National Bank of Northfield. It would have all been gone. And it wasn't protected money at all. There was no insurance at that time. So if your money was stolen, it was gone forever. It was lost. So that was all the money for the colleges in that bank. Most of the money for any local businesses was being held there. Plenty of people's life savings was held in the First National Bank of Northfield. would have all been wiped out. And there's no way of knowing whether Northfield would have been able to continue. The colleges might have been forced to declare bankruptcy. They might have been forced to shut down. Um, uh, Most of local businesses, something like the Ames Mill, which eventually became Malto Meal, might have had to shut down. We wouldn't have Malto Meal. The town would have been changed forever, completely. And the other reason why it's important is because Northfield's actions had such a big impact on the country by stopping the James Younger gang, this gang that had been ravaging the entire country for so long, that had been ravaging the South for so long, and very likely would have continued to do more, at least eventually. Even if they had escaped to Canada, they probably would have come back and done more. So many lives, so much of people's savings and hope was saved by the people of Northfield on that day. And so those are a couple of reasons why it's so important to Northfield and to the country. There are people all around the country that know about the Northfield bank raid. Movies have been made about it. Several movies have been made about the Northfield bank raid. It's an event with a huge impact.
Yeah. So we've kind of got an idea for how we can reflect on this story for this week. It can be hard sometimes when you're looking at something so long ago to really appreciate and understand how much it has affected your life today. But if you have a parent or a family member that has been part of the colleges, that has been part of any of the businesses in town, like Multimeal, if there are any of these things that we've mentioned that have been important for shaping where your lives are today, even as simple as the school you go to, and the support that's been able to be given. How have pieces of your lives been changed and changed for the better because of the things that were saved back in 1876? Don't necessarily need to write this or turn it into anything, but if you look around your neighborhood, look around your town, you can come to appreciate how these actions of the past have made life better for today.
Yeah.
Logan, do you have any parting words there?
No, I think that sums it up well. That's
All right.
what we can ask them to do. And I just hope if we were able to have a regular Defeated Jesse James Days this year, I hope to see him there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, hee haw, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.